Imagine being trapped in a coffin made of two boats, your arms and legs sticking out, the sun burning your skin as you lie there helpless. Your force, fed milk and honey until your stomach churns, until you vomit and soil yourself, until your body rebels against the endless sweetness that has become poison in your veins. You cannot move. You cannot wipe the filth from your skin. You cannot escape the crawling sensation as flies land on your flesh, as insects lay eggs in the waste pooling beneath you, as maggots hatch and begin to feed. This was Scaphism, one of history's least known, yet most horrific punishments, devised in ancient Persia. It was not designed merely to kill, but to break a person slowly, to strip them of dignity, to drown them in their own excrement while insects bred in their wounds, and to ensure that each hour, each breath, was another small taste of death while still alive. Few punishments in history match the cruelty of Scaphism. It wasn't swift. It wasn't merciful. It was a spectacle of decay, a performance of prolonged agony played out in the heat of the sun, in the buzzing chorus of flies, in the slow, conscious awareness that your body was turning into a banquet for insects. In the coming moments, we will dive deep into this dark chapter of human history, where forced feeding led to diarrhea, insects bred in rotting flesh, and death came not as a release, but as the final note in a symphony of unimaginable suffering. Because history isn't just dark. Sometimes, it's unimaginable. To understand how Scaphism came to exist, we must first step into the world of ancient Persia, one of the mightiest empires the world had ever seen. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great, stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of India. It was a realm of unimaginable wealth. Gold flowed from the conquered lands, grand palaces rose in Persepolis, and the empire thrived on trade routes that stitched together the known world. But along with this wealth came strict laws, an unyielding hierarchy, and a ruler whose authority was considered divine. Persian society valued order, loyalty, and obedience to the king above all else. Treason was not simply a crime against a ruler. It was a crime against the divine order that held the universe together. Blasphemy and grave offenses that threatened stability were considered acts deserving not just of death, but of punishment so severe that it would sear fear into the hearts of those who witnessed or heard of it. Public executions in Persia were tools of deterrence, messages broadcast to every corner of the empire that betrayal, murder, or sacrilege would not be met with quiet retribution, but with an agonizing spectacle. Punishments were not only about removing the criminal, but about demonstrating the absolute power of the king, reminding everyone that the empire's stability was maintained through fear as much as through law. In this climate of power and paranoia, Scaphism was born. This was not a punishment for petty thieves or drunken brawlers. It was reserved for the worst of the worst, those who betrayed their ruler, those who defied the sanctity of family by committing murder, those who spat in the face of the empire's gods and order. To condemn someone to Scaphism was to declare them an enemy of Persia itself, a traitor so vile that a simple death was too merciful. It was a statement: this is what happens to those who threaten the divine order of Persia. And so, within the splendor of palaces and the hum of prosperous markets, the machinery of cruelty turned silently in the background. And when it was needed, it would be unleashed in the form of a punishment so horrific that it would become a whispered legend for centuries to come. So, what exactly was Scaphism? This nightmare punishment, whispered through history as one of humanity's most horrific methods of execution. It began with stripping the condemned naked, robbing them of even the dignity of clothing. Then, the executioners would place the victim inside a hollowed-out wooden boat, or clamp them between two boats, one on top of the other, with carefully cut holes so that the head, arms, and legs protruded while the rest of the body was trapped, immobile, and helpless. Then came the force feeding. Milk and honey. symbols of sweetness, were poured down the victim's throat again and again until the stomach could take no more. The body would rebel, and vomiting would follow, but there was no escape. They would be fed more and more, until the sweetness turned into poison, and the body surrendered to violent, uncontrollable diarrhea. This filth, unable to drain away, would collect inside the boat, soaking the victim's skin, seeping into wounds and pores, turning the wooden coffin into a putrid, stinking cesspool. But that was only the beginning. Honey would then be smeared on the victim's exposed skin and around every orifice, eyes, mouth, ears, genitals, anus, creating a sticky, glistening invitation to the buzzing horrors of the natural world. The victim would then be left under the burning sun, often in stagnant water, swamps, or marshes, to ensure that flies and insects would easily find their way to the feast prepared for them. And they would come. Flies would swarm, landing on the honey-coated skin, laying eggs that would hatch into maggots, which would then begin to burrow into the flesh. The insects would crawl into every opening, gnawing, breeding, laying more eggs, while the victim remained fully conscious, unable to move, unable to swat away the swarms, feeding on their skin, their eyes, their wounds. Infections would set in. The skin would begin to rot where it remained in constant contact with the waste pooling inside the boat. The sun would blister the exposed skin during the day, while the cold and dampness would chill the bones at night. Dehydration would gnaw at the victim, lips cracking, tongue swelling, while the body would still be forced to expel more waste from the constant milk and honey. The end would not come swiftly. Death arrived in layers, first through sepsis, as rotting flesh and infection poisoned the blood, then dehydration, then shock, with the victim drifting in and out of agonizing consciousness, aware of their own body being slowly devoured, inside and out. Scaphism was not designed to kill quickly. It was designed to turn a human body into a living ecosystem of decay, to transform a person into food for insects, to showcase the complete and utter domination of the human spirit and flesh under the crushing weight of the state's power. Because in the empire that created it, death was not enough. They demanded suffering so complete that even the sweetness of milk and honey became the instruments of the worst torment imaginable. Why would a civilization as grand as ancient Persia invent a punishment as horrific as Scaphism? Why not a swift sword or a quiet exile? Because Scaphism was designed to dehumanize. It was meant to strip away every last shred of dignity from the condemned, turning a once living human into a helpless, rotting husk, an object of horror for all who saw or smelled what was left behind. Death was not the goal. Suffering was. In the Persian worldview, heavily shaped by Zoroastrian concepts of cosmic order, there was a clear division between good and evil, truth and lies, loyalty and betrayal. A crime like treason wasn't just an act against a king or a law. It was a crime against cosmic justice itself. It was a disruption of the sacred order that held the universe together. And that disruption required not just retribution, but a retribution that mirrored the seriousness of the crime. Persian justice could be harsh, but it was consistent with the belief that the punishment should fit not just the crime, but the threat the crime posed to society. And so, executions were not simply acts of removal, but acts of demonstration, lessons etched into flesh for all to see. Other Persian punishments were brutal by modern standards. Impalement was used, where the condemned was hoisted on a sharpened stake, their own weight driving them slowly downward. Flaying alive was also employed, peeling the skin from the living body to make an example of those who dared to commit grave offenses. But even among these horrors, Scaphism stood apart, where impalement brought a relatively quicker, though agonizing death, and flaying led to death from shock and blood loss within hours. Scaphism was calculated to prolong. It was a slow, motion execution, a public exhibition of a traitor's descent into filth and decay. days and even weeks of conscious torment before death. The victim could be displayed near markets, riverbanks, or military roads, ensuring that the stench and the sight of their suffering would infect the minds of all who passed by, reminding them of the price of betrayal. Scaphism was the ultimate symbol of Persian retribution. Painful enough to satisfy cosmic justice, horrifying enough to deter future treachery, and degrading enough to erase the condemned's humanity long before death finally claimed them. Because in the harsh dance between power and punishment, the Persians believed that fear was the strongest guardian of order. When we speak of Scaphism, much of what we know comes from the writings of the Greek historian Plutarch. His account of this nightmare punishment centers around Mithridates, a Persian soldier who found himself on the wrong side of imperial wrath. Mithridates' crime: he had killed Cyrus the Younger, the brother of King Artaxerxes II, during the chaotic Battle of Cunaxi in 401 BCE, a chaotic conflict rooted in betrayal, ambition, and dynastic power struggles. Mithridates' actions were seen as a grave offense, even though he was a soldier in battle, because Cyrus was a royal and his death was politically sensitive. And so, Mithridates was condemned to Scaphism. Plutarch writes that Mithridates was force, fed milk and honey, restrained within the wooden shell of the boats, smeared with honey, and left exposed under the burning Persian sun, his flesh and waste slowly turning into a feast for insects. Plutarch claims that Mithridates, trapped in this living tomb, survived for 17 days before death finally came, ending an agony almost unimaginable to consider. 17 days of lying in one's filth, being eaten alive, stung by insects, delirious with thirst and infection, each day a new level of torment. Each hour a reminder of the cruelty devised by man in the name of justice. Of course, modern scholars debate the reliability of Plutarch's account. Plutarch, writing centuries after the event, was a moralizing historian, often using stories to illustrate the virtues and vices of individuals and nations. There are questions about how accurately he recorded the details, and whether the story was exaggerated to shock Greek audiences with the barbarity of Persian punishments. But regardless of these debates, Plutarch's account remains the primary historical source on Scaphism, shaping the way it has been remembered throughout history. The mere fact that Greek historians, accustomed to recording the brutality of war, empire, were horrified enough by this punishment to document it, tells us how Scaphism stood out even among ancient cruelties. While Herodotus and Ctesias do not explicitly describe Scaphism, they do document the brutal nature of Persian punishments, stories of impalements, of mutilations, of entire families executed for treason, providing the context in which a punishment like Scaphism could exist. In the long lineage of ancient cruelty, Scaphism was the crown jewel of horror in Persia's arsenal of punishments. It was ultimate deterrent, a slow, humiliating, and revolting death that terrified enemies and subjects alike, echoing through the chronicles of those who witnessed or heard of it. Because even in the ancient world, where brutality was often the norm, Scaphism was something else entirely. A punishment that even hardened soldiers and seasoned historians could not forget. It's one thing to hear about Scaphism as a brutal execution. It's another to truly understand how it killed, step by slow, horrifying step. First 2 days, the sweet poison begins. Move, they are force, fed milk and honey till they vomit, their stomachs bloated, their bodies rejecting the unnatural flood of sweetness. But there is no mercy, no pause, more milk, more honey, until diarrhea begins, filling the wooden coffin with excrement. The sticky honey is smeared on every exposed patch of skin and every orifice. Nostrils, ears, genitals. Anus, turning the victim into a living, breathing bait for insects. The air is heavy with the stench of feces and sour milk, their own skin crawling with the first curious flies. They are fully conscious, unable to wipe away a single drop. Day 3 to 5. The insects arrive, By the third day, the flies begin laying eggs, burying them in the honey. Slick skin and the open orifices, while the warm rot of excrement invites beetles, ants, and biting insects. Maggots begin to hatch, squirming and feeding on skin softened by moisture and decay. The condemned feels them, creeping, biting, burrowing. The buzzing becomes a constant soundtrack, a reminder that each moment of stillness is another second of being consumed alive. The pain begins to sharpen, as open sores form, and infections take root beneath the surface of the skin, generating heat, pus, and an escalating agony that throbs with every heartbeat. Day 5 to 10 flesh turns to rot. Between days 5 and 10, the body begins to rot while the victim is still alive and conscious. The mixture of excrement, honey, sweat, and blood becomes a festering swamp, drawing in clouds of flies and wasps that drink the fluids and tear at the flesh. Maggots grow fat in the wounds, burrowing deeper, while bacteria infiltrate the bloodstream, leading to sepsis, causing fevers so high that the victim drifts in and out of hallucinations, skin burning while their flesh decomposes. Dehydration gnaws at them, their tongues swelling, their lips cracking open. As they gasp in the heat of the sun and the cold of the night, begging for water that only arrives as more forced milk, which worsens their torment. Their screams weaken into groans, but consciousness clings to them, forcing them to feel every squirm, every bite, every sting. Day 10 to 17, or until death. The final agony. By the 10th day, the body is an open wound, crawling with life that should not be there. The victim's organs begin to fail, kidneys shutting down from dehydration, the heart struggling under infection and exhaustion, the brain clouded with delirium as toxins flood the blood. Their breath becomes ragged, foul, their eyes glassy, but pain still burns in every nerve, forcing them to feel the maggots eating into the muscle, the insects nesting in the cavities of their flesh. Sometimes, death would arrive on the 10th day. Sometimes it would take 17 days, as Plutarch claimed for Mithridates. But whenever it came as a final, dark mercy. Because Scaphism was not about killing quickly. It was about transforming a human being into a living banquet for insects, a slow unraveling of flesh and spirit, a punishment so horrifying it turned milk and honey, symbols of life and sweetness, into instruments of degradation and agony. As the victim lay dying, surrounded by the buzzing swarm, stinking of rot and waste, they were a living message to all who might think to betray or defy the state. Death came not with dignity, but with a complete erasure of humanity. If you think a mosquito bite is annoying, imagine thousands of insects making your flesh their home. This was Scaphism. This was the ultimate slow death. It's easy to talk about pain when discussing Scaphism. It's harder to grasp the psychological horror it unleashed on both the victim and those who witnessed or heard of it. For the condemned, Scaphism was a descent into living hell. Imagine the terror as you're strapped down, knowing you cannot move, cannot scratch an itch, cannot wipe away the insects crawling on your eyes or inside your ears. Every day, your own body turns against you, rotting while you're still awake, while you beg for death, but a force, fed the milk and honey that will prolong your torment. You have no control over your body. Your dignity is stripped away piece by piece. Your excrement coats your skin, the air is thick with your own stench, and the buzzing of flies becomes a constant reminder that the world sees you not as a person, but as a carcass that hasn't died yet. There is no privacy, no final mercy, only the knowledge that each hour is another hour for the insects to feed on you while you are still alive. But Scaphism was never just about the suffering of one individual. It was about the spectacle of fear. In a society where the ruler's power depended on maintaining order, such public, drawn-out executions became tools of control. They turned execution into a theatre of terror. Anyone who witnessed or even smelled the aftermath of Scaphism would understand what betrayal, treason, or defiance against the state would cost them. Word of such punishments would spread through villages and cities, whispered in markets and along trade routes, embedding fear deeply within the population. People learned that the price of stepping out of line wasn't a quick death, but a death that would take days or weeks. That would humiliate them, strip away their humanity, and make them a feast for flies and maggots. It's a reminder of how societies have historically weaponized execution to enforce order. Throughout history, rulers have used torture and public death to keep their populations compliant. Crucifixions in Rome, impalements in the Ottoman Empire, hangings and beheadings in medieval Europe, and Scaphism in Persia. It's a dark reflection on how power and fear are often intertwined. The goal wasn't just justice. It was the display of power, the demonstration that the ruler held not only the right to take your life, but to do so in a way that would make others shudder in fear for generations. Scaphism was one of the most extreme examples of this philosophy, an execution designed not simply to end a life, but to erase a soul while leaving the body alive, all in the name of maintaining social order and the authority of the state. Because in the cold logic of power, a slow, horrific death could often speak louder than any law or proclamation. As the ancient Persian empires crumbled, so too did the practice of Scaphism. Empires rose and fell, cultures shifted, and the administrative systems that upheld such punishments eventually gave way to new rulers with new methods of control. Yet, Scaphism did not vanish because people became kinder. It faded simply because systems changed, and other forms of punishment took its place. The memory of this horror remained, buried in the scrolls of historians and the whispers of cultures that had seen what could happen when power was unchecked. Modern historians regard Scaphism as one of the worst punishments ever devised by human hands. It was not simply execution, but an intentional breaking of body and spirit across days, using the victim's own flesh as the instrument of their torture, weaponizing insects and the slow decay of the body as a method of punishment. It is rarely discussed in popular culture, overshadowed by other brutal methods like crucifixion, impalement, or the medieval tortures of Europe. Yet precisely because of its rarity, it remains one of history's hidden horrors, a dark reminder of how creative cruelty can become when society and power structures decide that fear is the best tool for control. When you read about Scaphism, you are forced to confront a hard truth, that the capacity for cruelty has always been there, woven into the fabric of human history, hidden behind banners of justice, law, and order. Because while societies progress, and while we celebrate the advancements of civilization and morality, the human capacity for cruelty remains a dark constant, waiting for moments of power, fear, or fanaticism to bring it to the surface. Scaphism is a story that isn't comfortable to tell, but that discomfort is why it must be remembered. They say history is written by the victors, but some stories are carved in the screams of the forgotten. Scaphism reminds us that even the grand Persian Empire, with its wealth, culture, and power, ruled with fear when it suited them. Behind the glittering palaces and monumental victories, there was a darkness that fed on human suffering, using terror as a tool to maintain order. It is a reminder that beneath glory, darkness can hide, waiting for the right moment to show its true face. History is dark, and we must remember it.